The first time you really take a moment to look at a map of Africa, something feels slightly off. At first, you may not even know what it is. Most people don't. But the longer you look, the clearer it becomes. Across deserts, forests, and rivers, there are borders that look unusually straight, straighter than you'd expect in a place shaped by nature and centuries of human movement. They don't curve around mountains or follow rivers the way borders often do elsewhere. Instead, they cut across the land as if the terrain beneath them didn't matter at all. And once you notice that, a quiet question starts to form in your mind. Why does Africa look like this? For most of history, Africa didn't have borders like the ones we see today. People didn't live inside fixed countries. They lived within communities, kingdoms, and networks that shifted over time. Movement was normal. Trade routes expanded and faded, languages blended, and cultures overlapped. Boundaries existed, but they were flexible. They followed rivers, forests, and deserts, and more importantly, they followed people. Identity wasn't locked to a line on a map. It was shaped by family, language, and land. The idea that a perfectly straight line could divide lives, cultures, and histories simply didn't exist yet. In the late 19th century, that began to change. Far away from Africa, in European cities filled with quiet rooms and long tables, political leaders and diplomats gathered to make decisions about the continent. They spread out maps, measured distances, and discussed control, not daily life. Most of them had never set foot on African soil. They weren't thinking about villages, migration routes, or cultural ties. They were thinking in terms of ownership, influence, and efficiency. And perhaps the most unsettling part of all is this: the people who lived on those lands were not part of the conversation. Decisions about their future were being made without their knowledge, let alone their consent. Africa was being divided on paper, long before the lines would ever exist on the ground. If you were asked to divide a place you had never visited, you wouldn't know which rivers mattered or where communities began and ended. You wouldn't understand the land or the people living on it. So you'd look for something simple. Straight lines made sense in that context. They were easy to measure, easy to draw, and easy for different powers to agree on. Latitude and longitude offered clean solutions to complex problems, at least on paper. Rivers were inconvenient. Mountains were unpredictable. Cultures were complicated. Straight lines were not. So rulers and pens moved across maps, cutting through deserts, villages, and families with no awareness of what lay beneath. From a distance, the result looked neat and organized. On the ground, it was anything but. Years later, colonial rule came to an end and new African nations emerged. But when independence arrived, the borders remained. Not because they were perfect or fair, but because changing them felt dangerous. Ethnic groups that had once lived together found themselves separated by national lines, while rival groups were suddenly forced into the same countries. Identity, which had once been fluid, became political. Questions of belonging became questions of power. Tensions grew, and in some places, conflicts followed. Not everywhere and not forever, but often enough to leave lasting scars. Lines that had once existed only on paper had become real boundaries that people were expected to live within. So why weren't the borders changed? Because once the map was set, moving even a single line risked unraveling the entire system. If one border shifted, others would be questioned. And the fear was that trying to fix the past could create even more instability in the present. Faced with that risk, many leaders chose continuity over correction. The borders stayed, not because they made sense, but because they already existed. Sometimes what remains isn't what's right, it's what feels least dangerous to change. Africa today is not broken. It is diverse, resilient, and deeply complex. But the borders still influence politics, economies, and identities in ways that trace back to those original decisions. All because of lines drawn long ago, far away, by people who never had to live with the consequences. Straight lines can be drawn in seconds, but once they shape lives, their effects can last for centuries. And in Africa, those lines are still speaking.